So let's go on the journey. You know, when I first started in the supply chain, I thought that we added technology, we added continuous improvement, we shook it up, and we drove value. And this is an exercise that I do every year for the Supply Chains to Admire, and Regina's on the line. And we basically plot what I'm going to call orbit charts against the peer group. And so here we have Newell and great company. And we have the peer group, which is household non-durables. Now you can see that the average for household non-durables, the average operating margin is 16%, and the average inventory turns is 4.84. But look at what happened over time. Did the industry get better? No. The industry declined in terms of inventory effectiveness and also cost. And so you've got that pattern. But look at Newell's pattern. Newell's pattern is bigger, which means it's less resilient to the industry. The bigger the pattern, the less resilient I am. And also, if you look at Newell's progress, I'm sorry, Mary, but you're declining faster than the industry, right? And so if you look at your progress, you know, you've got 9% operating margin and 3.92 inventory turns. Now, Mary, can you come up? I am, and you don't know this, and so you're probably like, oh my gosh, but I've known you for a while, so hopefully you'll go along with the program. So when you look at this, do you have technology?
We have technology.
Okay, what kind of technology do you have?
We have SAP as our ERP system. Let's see, we have IBP is part of SAP, and a lot of planning, transportation planning, and PKMS in our distribution centers. So a lot of things that kind of feed into that structure.
Are you surprised by this?
I would comment, I'm not surprised. I would be interested in your thoughts on from more recent years, because Newell did go through a consolidation of our supply chains. So Newell Brands has been built over the years by a lot of acquisitions. So, and as such, we had 23 supply chains in our network before 2022, yes. And then we took it down to one. And then we had mixing centers and less ship points and ship lanes. So I would hope that we're starting to see that change since we consolidated our supply chains.
So if you look at 2021 to 2022 to 2023, you've got a little bit of improvement in inventory turns in 2022 to 2023, but you're going backwards in margin. And what do you measure as supply chain excellence?
We do, as a company, we are looking at margin from a supply chain excellence standpoint. Certainly it's cost, and that's across the board on all of the different functions within the SCORE model. Each function has a different, so very much what we've been talking about is certainly if procurement makes a decision to use a lower cost carrier, then that can impact our on-time performance, which is going to drive on-time fines from our retailers. So we are working more closely together on that to make sure those inputs are given to our procurement teams when they're going through the bid process. So those things are areas where I see that Newell is evolving and thinking about more of and moving forward in that arena.
So the interesting thing is we see that cost reduction in functions does not translate to margin. And one of the things that's happened is we've automated procurement, we've automated transportation, things like RFPs, transportation, combinatorial math, let's get the best design, but we're not actually moving to margin. So anything you want to add? Because I'm going to move on and pick on somebody else.
No, I'll give the spotlight.
Let's give Mary a hand here. Thank you. She didn't know she was going to have to do that. Okay, Thermo Fisher, and he hasn't shown up yet. Thermo Fisher is in the, oh, he's just here. Okay, but he's got to get his name tag. So we go way back, but medical device is an industry which operates at 20% margin. And if you look at medical device, and we've got the pink, which is medical devices and industry. What's happening in that industry? Are we driving improvement at the intersection of inventory turns and cost as an industry? Yeah, look at 2014. So I'm driving improvement in margin from 2014 to 2021. Now I'm going backwards, 2020, 2022, 2023. I would allege medical device made pretty good margin during the pandemic. Look at Thermo Fisher. Thermo Fisher operates at 17% margin and 4.43 inventory turns, right? So you just walked in, welcome. You want to come up and talk a little bit about your journey? Yeah, come up. I'll make it a safe space, I promise. You've not introduced yourself to the group, so this is a good way that we can get a little introduction as well. So just tell the group a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Hi, this is Praveen Kamble. I'm with Thermo Fisher. So I lead supply chain and distribution logistics technologies. So I'm on the IT side, but intersect very well with supply chain function. I I cover about 3 of the groups within Thermo Fisher, but then I also lead some of the enterprise programs that are company-wide.
So what does Thermo Fisher make?
So we call it as like fully end-to-end. So all the way from molecule to a drug that we buy. So we are involved throughout the life cycle of medicine.
And so as I understand it, you're actually in the supply chain role in IT, correct?
Yes. So I lead technologies that support supply chain.
Okay, so purchase, implementation, refinement of technology to improve supply chain.
Correct.
Okay. And how many technologies do you have?
Let's start with how many ERPs we have. We have 100 plus ERPs
Okay.
in the company.
And this is not an uncommon thing, okay?
Yep.
How many models do you have, like, technologies, improve, APS kind of models?
Yeah. So again, Thermo Fisher is a very diverse company. So we say it's one company, but it's like each group division operate on their own. So we have a mix of all different technologies across planning and procurement and warehouse management. So call it every flavor, we have.
And one of the things we talked earlier about was organizational alignment of models and people. And when you think about Thermo Fisher, how aligned are you?
Walk me again through the question.
How aligned are you? Like the functions, the regions, the divisions, corporate?
Yeah. So again, as we see some of the charts, right? We had enjoyed high margins. Supply chain was not really as big of a focus before pandemic, as is the case with many of our peer industries as well, like peer companies as well. So supply chain was always like, okay, get things done view. It's only recently because of the inefficiencies which got exposed during the pandemic that supply chain now has a much bigger voice. A big shift, what I'm seeing happening, Laura, is supply chain is now getting in front of the customer. So supply chain is driving customer interactions, whereas in the past, it was never exposed to, interacting directly with the customers.
Well, welcome. Thank you.
Yep.
I put you on the spot, but I made it a safe spot, right?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so we've got about 45 people online. So back to the question which you asked, which was really great about alignment. Does this give you a feel about, we got a lot of technology, we got a lot of people, we're reducing costs. Cost doesn't necessarily drive margin. There's a big difference between reducing cost and driving margin, because I've got to reduce, across commercial and operations teams to drive margin. So often what happens is I will reduce cost in a function like transportation or manufacturing or procurement, but I may not reduce total cost, or I may actually shift demand versus shape demand, which is moving demand from period to period, and not really increase the market potential of that good. Market potential is, do people want to buy it? And so this whole issue around cost versus margin is a major discussion people need to have. Okay. So most people are looking at the journey for cost versus the journey for margin. And so everybody knows what R square is, right? So many of you have been in David's class, yeah? And, this is an early piece of work that Joseph did for me. If we look at the food, pharmaceutical, and chemical industry, and we look at the R square, and we look at the intersection of operating margin and inventory turns, and the relationship of market cap to employee versus looking at cost of goods sold and inventory turns, you can see the difference in the R square. Would you rather be measuring margin or cost? Margin, right? Only 5% of people can easily measure margin in decision making. I don't know about Western Digital or Thermo Fisher or Newell, but most companies measure on functional cost, and functional cost doesn't necessarily translate to margin. So let's take a critical view. There's a company called Gartner that I used to work with. And when I was at a company called AMR Research, we developed the top 25. And then Gartner bought AMR, and it's the Gartner top 25. And if you look at the literature, there's a lot of reference to the Gartner top 25 saying these are the best supply chains. But if you look at the gray boxes, those are underperforming against the peer group. So the Gartner top 25 is based 50% on opinion. And many people feel that certain companies are doing really well when they're really not. So if you look at somebody like Cisco Systems or Lenovo, they're not performing against the peer group. And so to really drive improvement, we have to measure against the peer group. We've got to measure over time, and we need to be able to have something that elevates the conversation to the boardroom, which I think is market cap per employee. So when you look at the Gartner top 25, in fact, I wrote a blog post of, the beauty contest, right, that has no beauty. These companies tend to underperform 80% of the time on revenue, 50% of the time on margin, 60% of the time on inventory turns, but yet we espouse that they're doing great work. And when you go to most conferences, these are the companies that you will see on stage. You will not necessarily see the companies that are beating the peer group, like Asso Abloy, because they're busy and they don't necessarily want to be on stage, right? So that gets us to the research. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the research, and then we're going to take a break. So I wanted to continue the work of how can we look at the data from 1982 to 2023 for each individual company based upon the refined industry peer groups, 114 dependent and independent factors, and how can we look at what drives value based upon market cap per employee. What I'm trying to do is define the financial metric in the balanced scorecard. And the testing is not complete. We've got models that we've developed for each industry, which is what's going to be presented after break. We have not finished the testing for the models. So what does it mean to test a model? What we're trying to do is to take the period of 2013 to 2019 and try to get the model to predict 2023. And we're not there yet. So we're doing what we call in the market backcasting, right? Where we take a period and we put that in the model and we say, is this model really definitive of that 2023 period? Once we do that, then we will be able to publish the results in the model. The other thing we're developing is a fundamental score. And the fundamental score is an individual number that each company will be given based upon their peer group, based upon how well they do on the regression formula and the betas, and it looks at value. We're not there yet either, but we're going to talk a little bit about the journey. And this is earlier data, but you can just see what are the metrics that matter as we look at correlation of market cap per employee. First thing I want you to see is the R squares are very high. And that was one of the surprises that David had originally, was this is very important, right? David's like all excited about, these are really great R squares, right? 75% of the value market cap per employee in the beverage industry is by measuring operating margin, inventory turns, return on invested capital, or we've currently changed to ROCE, or return on capital employed, and revenue per employee. But yet most beverage companies measure cost. 61% in business to business, which is Western Digital. Chemical, which Dave Winstone's going to be here in a little bit from Dow, over 50%. Diversified industries, 72%. Food, around 70%. Medical device, pharma, semiconductor. The other thing that you see is that the metrics that drive that market capitalization per employee are pretty similar, even though the industries are different. So these were earlier results. And Dave, come up and talk a little bit about your first reaction when we were at this stage in the research. How do you feel about these R-squares, and tell the group that sat in the back of the statistics class with me, what is this Jacques Barra?
Thanks, Philip. We were a little bit surprised that the performance, R squared of anything over maybe 0.3 or 0.4 on some large industrial data sets is pretty good. I'll give a lot of caveats and things in a little while, but and just having a high R squared in and of itself is not necessarily fantastic, because I know how to lie with statistics, and I can find ways to rev up the R squared in sort of illegal ways. But these R squareds that we're getting were legit, pretty good compared to, I'm not bashing George Runger's original work because he wasn't using such nice data, but he was getting order of magnitude lower improvements, lower R squared values among other things. Again, not his fault, the data just wasn't there. And so I was really happy about this. I mean, we have some kids here from the regression class. They know that some of the projects that we presented, we had R squares of 0.3. And did I give you guys trouble? No, right? I only humiliated a couple groups. But everybody did a good job. And as long as you can see that the data is explaining something in a statistically significant way, that's what you're looking for. So I was real happy with that. And this Jacques Barre guy, I thought that he was a dancer, but in fact, it turns out it's two statisticians. All that is, that number is a measure that the residuals from the regression, in other words, the error terms of the regression, are normal. And the reason we're interested in that is because that's one of the underlying assumptions that help to guarantee that the theory that we're using is correct. These are pretty good numbers in the right-hand column. The lower, the better. And ideally, we'd like them to be under 20 for this particular parameter. And generally speaking, these are not bad. You'll see in the later models that we do later on, do even better. Yeah, question, Peter?
Do I have a Zoom question?
Sure.
So the question is, how is the R squared on this chart? What is the context relative to building format?
So the question is, how is the R squared? What is the context of the definition to the measurement?
Sure. Okay. So this R squared, we're trying to predict market cap per employee, the expected value of market cap per employee. We're using the 4 X'd out columns as potential inputs to the model, and using those 4 inputs, R squared denotes the proportion of the variability in the system that's explained by our regression model. Higher R squared, the better. And so, for instance, if you had an R squared of 0.999, that would mean that our model very, very, very accurately and precisely predicts the expected market cap per employee. And if R squared is low, it means it's kind of a noisy data. You're not getting much information out of it. Is that adequate?
So this data, in fairness, was September, October. We're in the middle of our analysis, and what's going to happen is David and Joseph after break are going to show the newer models. And one of the things we did was we shifted from return on invested capital to return on capital employed. David and Joseph are real excited that we raised the R squared. Practically speaking, in the industry, it doesn't matter that much.
Actually, Tim's asking an important question because there were a lot to choose from. I'll get into that after. And
right.
As I've said a few times, and you'll hear me say it again, I'm not an expert on which are the best input measures, but you guys are, and Laura is.
So we started with 114 inputs and we tested for collinearity, and we wanted to be able to derive which inputs could give us not only the best R squared, so we had a better model, but we wanted to minimize collinearity, and we also wanted it to be applicable. So I didn't want a lot of factors because I really want to build technology that has, if you go back to my concept here, a balanced scorecard at the top for financial metrics is maybe 3 or 4 factors. Now, that's a little bit of tension for me and the Georgia Tech folks because they love modeling. I mean, they like groove on modeling, and they're like, well, but Laura, we get a better R square if we add, a couple more. And I'm like, I want a really simple model that, we could maybe build new AI kind of techniques and improve market capitalization. And I want it to be explainable and simple and actionable. So some of the factors are annual. Well, I want them to be operational. So something that Mary can measure now, right?
That
Yeah.
was the big trade-off. We had a lot of fistfights about that.
Yeah, and
She's tough.
Yeah, and they really want to talk to me about a better R square, and I say, is it explainable? Is it actionable? Is it something that's meaningful? And I want also there to be consistency across the industries, because sometimes you have a company like J&J that has a consumer products, a pharmaceutical and a medical device. And so what I wanted to have was a balanced scorecard that could be used for the whole company. Peter, we have a question. So the question is, market cap per employee is only for a public company. What would this mean for a private company? For a private company, I recommend that they compare themselves to the peer group and that they still have the same measurements, because it drives value, and they're going to want to benchmark against the peer group, because even though they may be private, they still have boards, and the boards want to know how well they're doing. It's just that if I focus on cost, I throw the supply chain out of balance, and I got to take that cost initiative over to margin. Anything you want to add there? Okay. Thank you, David. Now, David, after break, is going to talk about our latest models, which he does a better job on than I did, because you remember I sat on the back of my statistics class, and I've learned a lot from Gonza and Joseph and David. But we wanted the models to be simple, explainable, measurable, and actionable. And that's difficult because, you've got all these metrics and all these data, and people love the R square. So what have I learned, right? Today, we are implementing processes and technologies that do not necessarily improve value. And I am driving value by market cap per employee. We are focused on cost, and we're focused on functional cost, and we're not aligned. And we're in love with AI for AI, and we're trying to take our current models and take them to the next level with AI, which I think is a destiny of failure. Sort of like Henry Ford said, if he asked people what they wanted, they would say faster horses. We're building faster horses, not necessarily the next generation of how do we drive supply chain improvement. The other story that I think is really important is these models are effective at modeling 50 to 75% of market cap per employee through a pretty simple methodology, which when David writes his papers, which we're hoping we get in Harvard Business Review, I'm hope she changes the dialogue at the board level so that we don't just think about supply chain as the engine to reduce cost, but we think about the supply chain as the engine to drive value. A lot of times people will say, well, the industries are very different, and they are different. But this difference between industries is less significant than the differences between size of company. So the large multinational greater than 5 billion, which has hundreds of planners, lack alignment to a greater degree than the regional company that's 1 billion. So I'm hoping that we can drive alignment through this methodology to help these large multinationals. So our opportunity is to change the conversation, to write in the academic press, to do webinars, to write books, and, help people to not only match demand and supply volume, but to align cycles and think about how do I measure supply chain, both financially at a balanced scorecard and operationally. So questions at this point in time. Any questions from Zoom? Peter, can you just type in any questions for Laura just to see if anybody has any questions? So Praveen from Thermo Fisher is saying that the size of the company, he likes that point, right? I've also done some work with the University of Wisconsin that I'll be publishing on my newsletter that shows that the differences between industry are less significant than the difference by size of company, and that we really need to think about redefining work for the large multinational, because this alignment issue is huge as we think about what is the role of a region, what is the role of a division, what is the role of corporate, what is a good decision, how do I measure a good decision. Our evolution of advanced planning and enterprise resource planning do not really help us drive that alignment, and most companies lack governance around what is a good decision, who should make the decision at what point in time, and how do I measure it? So, Rich, you had a question. Rich's question is, did we look at price earnings? No, but we could. That's one of the reasons why we're doing this session before we publish, is if there's anything else we need to look at. So we're going to make a note of that. So David, can you make a note of price to earnings? We did not consider that, but there's nothing in the literature that has that as a potential value metric either, right? We did look at price to book, price to tangible book, EBITDA, so, and originally we were doing work on market cap, and then, we had a discussion about market cap per employee would actually normalize so that we could better look at small companies and big companies, together, right? And then someone said to me, well, if I wanted to improve this, all I would do is get rid of employees. And I'm like, yeah, that's not the behavior I want, right? Yeah, thank you for the question. Any other, Tim?
How did as market cap for that?
So how did we define the objective function, right? Well, we started with the literature search, and we started with the interviews of other people in, the industry that we respect. And then we started, doing the modeling and, looking at where we got the patterns. And the fundamental score was just all over the map. I mean, we just couldn't see patterns. Price to book, price to tangible book, not so good as we look at people that have done like total outsourcing and retailers, right? So we rejected that. So EBITDA, not as good of patterns, right? So that's how we went about it. It was sort of iterative. And you could argue maybe it's wrong, but it is something, and it is significant, right? So the question is, how does the supply chain affect revenue per employee? And I think about the supply chain as the growth engine, the comment of, are we making products people want to buy? The intersection of product lifecycle management and supply chain and bringing innovation to market, whether it's the design of the supply chain, whether it's the design of services, whether it's the management of new product launch, or the choice to get rid of products, because most of the time people have a lot of bad complexity and they're not necessarily getting rid of the products that are on the product line. So that intersection is so important and not really that appreciated. But in the supply chain Stood Meyer work, the companies that rise to the top do really well at the product life cycle and the supply chain intersection. Secondly, as you think about revenue per employee, also on-time delivery, as we think about, getting the product to the ultimate consumer, one of the things that I teach in the outside in class is the concept of demand latency. Our cycles have changed. E-commerce has shortened the cycle for e-commerce, but a lot of our life cycle has elongated the demand latency to the order. And the order is really not a good proxy for demand. So as we manage demand cycles and we match demand cycles and supply cycles, getting that work to get insights on the market and reducing the time for the supply chain to respond is a really important concept, because the order is carrying more bullwhip and it's carrying more latency. And so those redefinitions to outside in to use market data and to improve the response of the supply chain, I think is an important concept for revenue per employee. All right, are we ready for a break? Yeah, let's take a 15-minute break. I have that it is 10:38. So what if we came back at 10 till? And I'm going to shift to David and Joseph, who are going to share their work on modeling. And the bathrooms are right here, coffee's right here. So we're going to take a 15-minute break. We're going to come back at 10 till, okay?